cost of living crisis, is that the all-consuming issue, or what light have you got to shed from the polling that you have done as to what concerns people?
Well, in Britain, as around the world, inflation and prices are now the #1 issue that concerns voters and the public. And the question is just, coming straight after the COVID pandemic, unexpected to everybody, but now people are really waking up to this. Concern about something like COVID-19 has virtually vanished in the United Kingdom. And it is all about prices, the economy, and how the government is going to help. And I think the challenge facing the government is our finances are not in good shape following the COVID-19 crisis, but the public now wants to see more action and more spending, which of course seems to go against the grain of some of the things that Liz Truss, the most likely winner of the competition to become the next Prime Minister inside the Conservative Party, she's slightly against the grain of the things that she says she stands for, but she's probably going to be forced to do it when she turns her attention from the small number of people who are, of course, choosing the leader of the Conservative Party to the electorate as a whole.
By that, you expect that she will be forced into more help, essentially, these handouts that she's claimed that she doesn't want to see?
It seems very likely. Well, she's talking about a £30 billion cut to VAT. The challenge with cutting VAT, for example, is that it doesn't affect the price of food, which is already zero rated, and that is part of the inflation problem. And it's very expensive, and it may on itself just not be enough, to be quite honest, for the people who are most affected, which is at least a quarter of the population are going to be seriously affected this winter.
And Ben, what is also not enough is just core Conservative voters, party members. That's not going to be enough to keep Liz Truss and the Conservatives in power. They need, as Boris Johnson got in the last election, they need people who voted Labour or Lib Dem.
Absolutely. I mean, remember, they're 9, 10, 12 points behind in the polls, depending on which ones you look at, but they're behind. It's not impossible for them to come back and win. David Cameron was this far behind Ed Miliband, but we're now 12 years effectively into a Conservative government. People are starting, and people are starting to consider the alternatives. Keir Starmer is not Tony Blair, but he's certainly not Mr. Corbyn. And so as a result of that, Labour now do have a serious chance of forming a government if the current polling continues. So she's got to pull something together. Making inflation worse will not help. Not sorting out the NHS or letting people go cold at winter will not help. She needs to see. She's got 3 months, I would say, once she becomes leader, assuming it's her, to really show that she's competent to deal with the economy, and that is the fundamental issue. Because although she's not particularly popular at the moment, fewer people say they trust her to sort out the energy crisis than trust Mr. Sunak or Mr. Johnson or Mr. Starmer at the moment. But the one hope, perhaps, that the Conservatives might have is that if she can pull it together, Keir Starmer as a leader is less popular than his party at the moment, and he has not crossed the line that opposition leaders need to cross, where they get more people who say they're satisfied with their performance than dissatisfied. Both David Cameron and Tony Blair had that position when they were in opposition. Keir Starmer has not achieved that, and he's now been doing the job for some time.
Ben, could I ask you, because he has this very difficult line. He's trying to centralise his Labour Party. He's trying to go back to the Blair days. He's trying to distance himself from Jeremy Corbyn era. But he's not aligning himself with workers and striking workers as well. Would that make a difference to the public? Do they want to see him stand up for workers' rights, or do they want to see him distancing himself, do you think?
Well, I think you've identified it correctly there, to be honest. He's got a very difficult balancing act. The Labour Party is generally assumed to be on the side of working people, and it always has more people who say it understands the problems of ordinary people than the Conservative Party. That's pretty much the sort of standard position. But of course, militant left-wing politics is something that he's, of course, trying to distance himself from the previous regime. So he's got to get people who voted Conservative in 2019 to stay with him and support him. And that is a difficult balancing act. I think the one thing I would say is that as we go into a squeeze in the economy, a squeeze on people's incomes, people tend to become more sympathetic when they find their own circumstances squeezed with other people at the bottom of the pile. And therefore, he's going to have to juggle that. But at the same time, of course, he's trying to make sure that he's not tainted with Jeremy Corbyn and of course, whose government or whose opposition he was part of. And of course, the Conservatives will keep trying to go back to 2019. I think it gets harder and harder the further away that is.
Ben Page, a final thought about the Prime Minister, outgoing though he is. It's his last week in office. Lots of speculation about what his legacy will be. Some suggestions he might make some big policy announcement this week. I was reading in The Sun this morning, Mr Johnson's swan song will fuel speculation he could mount a comeback in the future if likely replacement Liz Truss proves a flop. What's the likelihood of that, do you think?
I would say never in politics, and Alex Salmond did that once in the SNP, but on a much smaller scale. I think what happened to Tony Blair after he left office might be more like what we're going to see with Boris Johnson. He may be a figure in British politics. I think the idea that he's going to become Prime Minister again at the moment is for the birds, to be quite honest.